been thinking about recently that I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on is the practical implications of this disagreement. So there's kind of two ends of the spectrum that you can go if you disagree with someone on a specific topic. So the first is a concept on one end of the spectrum is conciliationism. So that basically means, okay, I have a certain opinion and another individual that is also extremely competent has a different opinion. Conciliationism would say, okay, I should probably take the stance in between there, because at the end of the day, why is my opinion more valuable than somebody else that is also an expert? The other end of that spectrum is what's called steadfastness. So that means that you kind of stick with your opinion. So point being is, I'm curious your guys' thoughts, or anybody that wants to jump in here, of kind of this difference between, should we assume that the right answer is somewhere in the middle if we disagree with someone, or should we stick to kind of our interpretation of the research?
Something I'll chime in with, and kind of just conceptualizing why that disagreement may happen in the first place, is some more limitations with the way that we do research. So from a textbook standpoint, when you carry out a study, you're going to have a sample that has a certain inclusion criteria. So when we're looking to actually apply the findings of a given study, in the most textbook sense, we really can only generalize those to a very similar sample to what was actually studied. So when we're looking to apply these in the grander population, we start, blurring the lines a little bit of like, okay, well, maybe the subjects we're talking about this in the real world are a little bit older. Maybe they've been training for a little bit longer. And so you start blurring the lines a little bit from what was actually studied in terms of the inclusion criteria to what we're trying to generalize the findings to. And that even adds more uncertainty to the little bit of uncertainty that's in the data itself. And so that was the second thing I was going to say, is that, often in our field, especially, there is never, well, not never, but there isn't often clear-cut results that are clearly favoring one intervention over the other. Especially in like an 8-week training study, the likelihood of large effect sizes and very clear statistical significance is not a very common occurrence. So often what this does is it leaves interpretations to the people that are reading the data, just like you said, Josh, and that's where your personal experience starts to color exactly how you view these results. Even though the data are what the data are, we're looking at the same numbers, but exactly how we interpret those is open to our own personal experience and interpretation. So those are the two things that immediately came to my mind. But in terms of the kind of two approaches you said when you disagree with somebody, I think you could go either way, honestly. And I think it kind of comes back to what I said is like, how much do you rely on your own personal anecdote and experience to view that as a lens to which to view the data? And that would kind of, if you're very confident, you probably would lean more in the steadfast direction. And if you're a little bit more reserved in terms of how valuable you think your own anecdote and personal experiences, you might lean a little bit more in the former. But that was just my thing that came to my head. So I'm curious what anybody else thinks.
Yeah, just to jump in here and kind of build off that a little bit, I think that the personal experience aspect is huge, right? Josh, you mentioned like proximity to failure. I think that's a really interesting example of this happening, because we talk about this all the time in our lab meetings. There's, how are they measuring that proximity to failure? There's a lot of different ways that people do it. Let's say that they're using RPE, that's a subjective measurement. So does your personal experience with that, do you feel people can be pretty accurate? Or have you not found that to be the case in your practical experience? Or maybe the group going to failure, are you sure that they actually went to failure? Right. So there's a lot of gray area in there that I think that, and that's just one example of one area of research, but where our personal experience, even if it's subconsciously, can really get in there and, Zach, like you said, color the way that we see that data, and the way that we interpret it. And I think that that's a big piece of how two different people can look at the same data and come to pretty different conclusions. I think sometimes it comes down to just how skeptical are you, or how does this line up with what you've seen in the real world? So as you guys have said, I'd love to get more input on that too, but that's just one thing that I wanted to put in there. And I think that can really, sum up what's happening in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, I think to add to that, and I think, just reiterating what all of you guys have said, along with the kind of personal experiences that go into interpretation, I think you can also look at it as kind of the way that you weigh the literature and weigh each individual study depending on what you care about exactly. So if we're looking at strength, for example, you have something in single joint exercises versus multi-joint exercises, depending on how you care about the strength question and proximity to failure question in relation to strength, you might weigh each of those studies differently, right? Even if it was a 3RM, 6RM, 1RM. And so I think that kind of background as well will influence not so much the interpretation, because you could still interpret it that training closer to failure was better or training further from failure was better, but the way that you would weigh that would differ depending what the ultimate goal of the question is.